Hello, and welcome to episode 8 of the Gnosis and Science podcast. I am your host, Nicholas Thumb. In today's episode, we're going to start talking about biology and drawing parallels between mythological and spiritual traditions and biological functions of the human body, and how these processes are mirrored fractal expressions repeated at different scales. First, let's look at Norse myth and cosmology. All throughout history, trees have been a symbolic stand-in for the human nervous system. The world tree, Yggdrasil, is said to support the multiple worlds within Norse cosmology, with the Bifrost being the rainbow bridge that's said to connect the realm of man to the realm of the gods and is a representation of our chakra system, each one corresponding to an aspect of the human psyche that exists within the body's subconscious and our nervous system. So as we integrate the subconscious into conscious awareness, this channel clears. And the world tree has a few characteristics that we can link to biological and psychological processes. Now, at the top of the world tree, there is a golden eagle. This is the Godhead, higher knowledge and guidance, whose arch enemy is the serpent Nidhogg, and its sole purpose is the destruction of the world tree. It gnaws at the roots, intent to cause its downfall. And these roots pull water from 3 deep wells, providing nutrients to the tree and all the worlds that exist on it. These are the same wells said to contain great knowledge, one of which Odin sacrificed his eye to gain deeper wisdom. These wells are our subconscious, often represented as lakes or mirrors to reflect back at us what we don't currently see about ourselves. While the sacrifice of one of Odin's eyes, as he was hanging above the well, is the price that must be paid, as well as the pain that comes from this internal self-reflection. And Nidhogg is a lower scale expression of the devil, the adversary, a manifestation of the base desires of consciousness that we seek to satisfy due to the trauma within our roots, which ultimately will lead to the destruction of the world tree and the individual consciousness's inability to recognize itself as a greater whole as we give in to feed these cyclical trauma loops. Now, the entire time this is going on, there's a squirrel called Radagaster, and he runs up and down the trunk of the world tree, acting as a messenger, as the golden eagle and Nidhogg are constantly exchanging insults between one another. So now that we've seen this from a mythological point of view, let's look at it from a biological point of view. Radagaster represents the nerve signals within our body. Our autonomic nervous system is the big homeostasis regulator. It regulates things like heart rate, breathing, digestion, and blood pressure, and handles subconscious responses to stress, safety, and threat, while constantly trying to return you to a baseline or center. And it has 2 branches: the sympathetic nervous system for things like mobilization, alertness, our fight, flight, freeze, or fawn responses, and the parasympathetic nervous system, which is regulating things like rest, digestion, repair, and recovery. And homeostasis is the dynamic balance between these two. It's a state of equilibrium. There's also the afferent and efferent nerve signals, with afferent signals carrying sensory input going to our central nervous system, our spinal column and brain, or the trunk and the crown of the tree, telling us what's happening in our body and the world around us. This includes pain, temperature, and pressure, but also includes our internal state like heartbeat, gut tension, breath, and visceral sensations. Efferent signals, on the other hand, are commands going from the central nervous system to the body. This is how we respond through things like muscle contraction, glandular output, and autonomic adjustments like slower heart rate, tightening of muscles, and a releasing of hormones. So when we talk about trauma stored in the body, we're usually pointing to a persistent afferent signaling pattern that keeps biasing to a efferent output towards defense, a constant state of anxiety or a subtle tension or clenching. Now, the vagus nerve, which is the bifrost, is the major parasympathetic pathway and is mostly afferent. About 80% of it travels down the spinal column. That means it sends body state information to the brain, and your brain decides safety versus threat largely based on these incoming visceral signals. So meditation helps because it will slow our breathing, which alters the vagal afferents. It improves our interoceptive accuracy, and this allows us to actually process suppressed trauma and allowing it to come to the surface from the bottom of our subconscious, our well of wisdom. And done enough and regularly, this lowers baseline stress hormone output over time and trains the system to tolerate sensations without triggering a reflexive defense and entering a state of homeostasis. But this process isn't easy, and we can see this every time we bring the subconscious into conscious awareness. We're having to face and question our very identity that we've built to keep ourselves safe. This is expressed through this story of Thor facing his rival Jormungandr, the world serpent, the child of the trickster archetype Loki. Thor is an expression of the warrior archetype, while Jormungandr is our lens or worldview, our scope of understanding of ourself and everything that we view as outside of ourselves. So as the snake sheds its skin, growing larger and larger with each battle, so too does our own worldview increase as we're willing to be courageous and face things and experiences, be it internal or external, that are outside our comfort zone and facilitate growth and self-understanding. Now let's look at the biology of trees and their evolution and see how it mirrors the evolution of the soul. In the beginning, there was algae floating on water made up of biological material and solutions. And this provides shape, but not so much strength. Now, this limits how tall the algae can actually grow. But once it moves to a rocky surface, what is known as lignin was evolved. This is a rigid, tough, and waterproof kind of cell structure. And we can see how this mirrors the yin subconscious with flexibility and softness, and the lignin mirrors aspects of the yang, so coming together, this softness and structure of these different types of cells allow for a new dimension of growth upwards, just like how the conscious and subconscious, the coming together of these two dual aspects, allow for the self to emerge and the growth of the self. Now, once trees actually started to evolve to what we would recognize as trees, the actual part of the trunk of the tree that's only alive is the cambium. This is a thin layer of stem cells that's growing all along the trunk of the tree right underneath the bark. Now, this grows both inwardly and outwardly, and as the cells are pushed inward, they transform into xylem, stacking on top of one another, becoming harder and harder and turning into hollow tube structures. This is what creates those growth rings in wood. It's kind of like how ogres and people are a lot like onions. Each layer or mask that we build up on a psychological level is another layer of protection that clouds us from recognizing our true selves. This natural process mirrors the inward yin movement and death, and it's also what allows water to travel up from the roots to the leaves. So, going back to Yggdrasil, with the roots being the subconscious, and Nidhogg being the serpent or devil or stored trauma, and the leaves at the crown with the golden eagle being the godhead and conscious awareness. And looking at the crown, we can see that 95% of the water that arrives at the leaves is evaporated by the heat of the sun, exiting the leaves as a fine water vapor. This evaporation of water creates an incredibly intense negative pressure within the tree's biology, which is what allows for the water to travel all the way up from the roots to the top. This negative pressure is that pull that most humans have to question the world around them and their place in it. I say most because we've met people who are very content to not question anything. But most of us, on some level, wonder, is there something more to this whole thing? It's the thing that philosophy and religions try to answer. It's the question that ultimately all other questions lead to. Eventually, in spiritual traditions, this is the pull upward that's created through an act of surrender or non-attachment, or that nagging feeling you get when something doesn't sit quite right with you as you cling to something that no longer aligns with who you are, be that someone crossing a boundary or you eating sweets or something when you know you are trying to stick to a new diet. In biological terms, the more water that is evaporated, the stronger the tension and pull from the roots to the top. In spiritual terms, the more karma or subconscious patterning that is burned off, the greater this upward pull towards higher levels of conscious awareness. The more our system becomes a conduit between our unconscious roots and the conscious crown, like a circuit that's able to hold a higher voltage and a greater current. Now, we can see this concept in many world religions, like Gnosis, self-emptying in Christian mysticism, Vairagya, dispassion or letting go in Hinduism, Zimzum, or emptying to make room for the divine in Kabbalah, and the impermanence in Buddhism. In every case, this creates an inner vacuum that naturally draws awareness inward and upward. the water vapor at the crown of the tree that we see as luminous fields like halos and auras, we see around individuals like great teachers or saints. They appear when enough subconscious material has been processed as internal heat or tapas and has been generated when enough density has been burnt off. The halo is the visible side effect that highly coherent expressions of consciousness will naturally create. They create this type of friction with the material world. So as the tree ages, these xylem cells become filled with resin and form what is known as a heartwood. This is a special type of wood that is resistant to decay, located at the core of the tree. And while it is dead, it is structurally integral, and its removal would only be possible with the death of the tree. This is analogous to things like core trauma that we keep within our subconscious and our body's nervous system. These are core complexes or guardian knots in tantric systems, or samsaric seeds, or tendencies, or the frozen heart in Sufi mysticism. So heartwood is the oldest wound within our nervous system. It doesn't transport water, but it does hold the structure of who we are. So spiritually, these old traumas don't move life force, but it is what allows for this new living form to be created around us. So just like how the removal of this wood is only able to happen if the tree dies, resolving these core traumas leads to a complete rework of one's identity of self, what we call ego death. Now, the sugar that is produced at the crown of the tree through photosynthesis has to be transported back down to actually provide nourishment. So to do this, the phloem, this is the part of the cambium cells that grows outwards, splits into 3 different specialized tasks. There are sieve cells that get rid of everything from their individual components to the nucleus. So they essentially become empty, hollow living channels to transport sugar along the trunk down to the rest of the tree and connect with other sieve cells. Now they're kept alive by companion cells that give instructions, repair, and provide energy. This tool pair of this channel for sugar and signals it creates this dual pair creates a channel for sugar and signals and allows for the communication of damage reports up and down the tree. Then there are parenchyma cells, which have a variety of functions, from storing nutrients, sugar, and water during periods of drought or for winter, and while some repair damage, others defend against fungus and insects. Now, the last layer of stem cells is called the phloem. These cells die just like the xylem, but instead of turning into wood, they turn into bark. This is adding layers of protection from damage and parasites. The sieve cells are akin to enlightened teachers or saints. These are beings that act as egoless channels for divine knowledge and the teaching or sweetness, the sugar, the land of milk and honey from heaven flowing downward from the crown. And these companion cells are a lot like spirit guides, angels, or unseen intelligences. They function as a kind of a meta intent behind the channel. Now, the pareichemia cells mirror spiritual reserves, latent potential, karmic seeds, and internal protection that spirit activates when we're in a crisis. It's our reserves. And the inner resilience and the accumulated wisdom from past growth and practice. While the bark acts as a kind of psychological resilience and armor to keep harmful energies out, like people that drain us, psychological vampires in a sense. And these come from like past wounds that we've integrated from our shadow and have been metabolized and turned into our inner strength. It's our personal sovereignty and our capacity to maintain boundaries and say no. So now that we've covered how trees are fractal mirrored expressions of the human body, along with how, depending on the scale that one views things, they're the exact same thing within higher density realities. For example, Vishnu, if you've ever seen the image of Vishnu's body, the placement of the world of man is the exact same placement as the world of man in Yggdrasil. It's in the midsection. So Vishnu is the world tree, just viewed from a higher perspective, as well as the previous episodes in this podcast covering how the observation of reality on a conscious and subconscious level actually creates a cascading manifestation effect. Let's look at how this actually extends to altering DNA as we integrate the subconscious into conscious awareness, and how the DNA itself and the replication process mirrors the psychological process of self-actualization. DNA is made up of two helix structures forming the base spine, with one, the 5' 3' called the leading strand, and the other, the 3' 5' called the lagging strand, as it runs chemically in the opposite direction. These strands are expressions of the conscious and subconscious. Being made of a carbon sugar molecule, it holds the same meaning as the number 666. It's not evil or to be associated with the devil in that sense, or be outright rejected, but acknowledged as a representation of base physical earthly matter. While the phosphate is spirit, it's the passive feminine aspect of God, acting in the same way that glucose does for bread, providing a skeletal structure to support everything else. While for nitrogen, the things that make you a unique individual correspond to the four classical elements in Western magic and mysticism, each with their own subconscious association with an emotional aspect of the human psyche, with adenine and thymine corresponding to fire and air, as they are held and bound by two hydrogen bonds, while guanine and cytosine correspond to earth and water. They're held together by three hydrogen bonds. Then there's RNA, which comes into play during DNA replication. It acts as a temporary messenger. It is the bridge between true insight and actualization. When this happens, the DNA chain is split down the middle like a zipper. So just like how we start to identify with the observer as the self rather than the body or mind as we become aware of our true self-expression. This strand can be replicated all at once. The leading strand can. While the lagging strand has to be copied in segments called Okazaki fragments, much like how the subconscious has to be integrated in segments. It can't happen all at once. It's drip fed. With RNA acting as the start and end points of these segments. But unlike DNA, RNA replaces thymine with uracil. This is the divine insight that bypasses the ego. It is the flash of inspiration that we have to act upon before it fades, as these subconscious patterns shift this base sequence. So this process doesn't just explain how cells duplicate, but shows how conscious and subconscious integration is mirrored through biology and how it can be altered through the integration of our shadow, severing karmic cords and shifting our subconscious, and how our observation of the world on a physical level will change the molecular expression. When you integrate shadow, sever karmic cords, and shift your subconscious potential, you're not just changing your mind, you're changing your molecular expression. And because quark orientation determines atomic structure, which determines molecular bonds, this cascade flows both ways. So subconscious shifts cause potential vector change, which then can affect probability collapse with quark orientation altering atomic structure, which then changes DNA expression and certain phenotype manifestations in epigenetics. So our DNA and how it is expressed through family lines has to do with karma and how we have to process certain things. This goes from everything from how early your hair goes gray, if you go bald, to far more serious genetic diseases, abnormalities, and conditions. And I don't say this to cause anyone any form of guilt. You shouldn't. You shouldn't feel any guilt at all. If this is how it is expressed, and each soul will choose certain lessons to learn, and certain genetic expressions act as a way to facilitate this growth. So there is no finger pointing at all in any of this. But I hope that you found this video interesting. This was the first intro to biology and how these processes mirror the evolution of the soul. If you want to know more, leave a comment, a like, and I also have a course that I'll link in the description that I've made, and I will catch y'all in the next video or podcast. Yeah.